All right, people are still coming in, but we are right at noon, so we want to get going because we have a full hour. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Knight. I'm the Senior Outreach Manager with the Lenfest Ocean Program. I am also joined by my colleagues today, Kayla Ripple and Vicki Bell. And you will see that Kayla will be dropping resources about the project into the chat. So if you are not too familiar with the Lenfest Ocean Program, we are a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups to address the scientific needs of ocean and coastal managers and policymakers. To learn more, you can visit us at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can always sign up for our monthly newsletter to receive updates on all the projects we support and all the events we hold. So Kayla will drop the website into the chat. We are so excited to have joining us today the research team working on a project to inform ecosystem approaches to fisheries management in the U.S. Caribbean. We have Dr. J. Cruz-Motta from the University of Puerto Rico, Dr. Tarsila Seara from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and Dr. Stacey Williams from the Institute for Sociological Research. Over the years, they have built conceptual and quantitative models to help characterize the Caribbean's diverse marine ecosystems and brought that data together with local stakeholder knowledge. So this project is a great example of not only combining natural and social science methods, but also bringing together diverse forms of expertise. You can learn more about the project at their webpage, which Kayla will drop into the chat, as well as catch up on their most recent publication. From the webpage, you can also access webinar recordings of previous presentations this team has given that kind of charts the full story of this project. It's been ongoing for several years. I should also note, this project stems from a past task force we supported, the Fishery Ecosystem Plan Task Force, which laid out a process for operationalizing ecosystem approaches in fisheries that is evidence-based and stakeholder-driven. And to learn more about that, you can read their executive summary, again, which Kayla will drop into the chat. And before I get into the logistics and pass it over to the presenters, this work is part of a broader portfolio at Lenfest, where over the past 20 years, we've assembled task forces and funded research teams to better understand how to operationalize ecosystem-based fisheries management around the world. So check out this blog where my colleague Jason Landrum discusses all we've learned over the years. So a few webinar logistics. All attendees are muted to prevent any feedback or echoes during the webinar, but we do want to hear from you and are saving time at the end for questions. To submit a question, please type it into the Q&A panel at any point during the webinar. I'll keep track of these and we'll read them aloud at the end for the panelists to answer. You can also interact with the panelists and each other in the chat box. Please feel free to share any comments and any links to resources. If you can, please reserve questions for the team in the Q&A box and comments and resources for the chat, as it may get lost in the chat. That said, I will try to keep an eye on the chat in case people happen to put questions there, but I can't totally promise to keep track of it all. Lastly, this event is being recorded. Once available, I'll distribute the link to the recording along with links to all the materials shared in the chat. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Stacey Williams.
Thanks, Emily. Next. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is just on this slide is a brief outline of what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. I will be giving a brief introduction about the management and historical background of ecosystem-based fisheries management in the U.S. Caribbean. Tarsila will be covering what we've done with the qualitative approach in conceptual models. And then JJ will speak about the quantitative approach that we took in our project and describe a little bit about the multi-specific specific and multi-driver perspective approach to the program. So just to give you a little bit about the background on how ecosystem-based fisheries management came into fruition in the U.S. Caribbean. In 2016, the National Marine Fisheries Service of NOAA created the first ecosystem-based fisheries management policy. And this was based on the 6 guidelines. And this policy really aimed to enhance the sustainability, resilience, and productivity of marine resources by integrating not only the ecological, social, but also the economic factors into decision making. Going on next, in 2000 and 3 years later of March of 2019, the first roadmap implementation plan for the ecosystem-based fishery management in the U.S. Caribbean region was developed, and this was really led by Bill Arnold in NOAA. And in this plan, there was additional 6 guiding principles. They were very similar to that of NIMS. But this helped really form this roadmap implementation plan for the U.S. Caribbean. Next. After that, and in the same year in 2019, the Orion Sadiq, previously at Pew, now in NOAA, he really led in the creation of an ecosystem-based fishery management planning team. This was also with guidance of Bill Arnold and Sarah Stevenson and Maria Lopez. And this team, the main objective of this team was to engage stakeholders in order to develop a fisheries ecosystem plan for the U.S. Caribbean. So this had 19 members. However, the team looks a little bit different right now. This has been led by the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council, really with the help of Graciela. And also you could go to the next. You can keep on clicking. And Leah High of the council. But right now, this is what the ecosystem-based fisheries management technical advisory panel under the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council looks like. We have Sinai, Alila, Edwin, Kevin, Tarsila, JJ, and myself on this EBFM TAP under the council. Next. And later in 2019, JJ, Tarsila, and myself, we were awarded funding through the LendFest Ocean program to develop this and to carry out this project. Next. So the overall goal of the LendFest Ocean, our project with funding and help through the LendFest Ocean program, was to provide information and aim into building a fishery ecosystem plan for the U.S. Caribbean. And this FEP was to guide in hopes to be able to implement an ecosystem-based fisheries management for the U.S. Caribbean. So in order to do this, we followed the LendFest FEP loop, and that is to the right of your screen. And this loop has, again, about 5 steps. And this is, you could go to the next click. And this is well integrated with both the 6 policy guidelines through the national, the NIMS, and also with the roadmap implementation led by Bill Arnold. Both really they were well adapted, and they were adaptability and carried out over really next. But for our project, we really focused on step 1 is where are we here right now. So next. So this, in order to develop a fisheries ecosystem plan, we used the information collected through our project along with the EBFM TAP members and also the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council. We all worked together in development of this FEP. However, stakeholder engagement was very important. Next. Their input was very important in developing this FEP. And Tarsila will be, like in her slides, will be later speaking of who these stakeholders were and how these conceptual models were created. Next. So to give you some context of the U.S. Caribbean, the U.S. Caribbean is managed in 3 management areas. We have Puerto Rico, we have St. Thomas and St. John, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. All 3 have their separate management plans. They have when comparing them to mainland, have the smallest fisheries, smallest landings, however, have the most diverse fisheries when comparing to the US mainland. Next. Also in the US Caribbean, it is multi-specific, it has multi-drivers, it has the environment, the ecosystem is very complex. It has a diverse array of habitats, making it very complex system. There's also different gears being used here in the Caribbean, and there's also multi-objective systems. So this really sets itself to be an ideal system to implement ecosystem-based fisheries management. And we were using this ecosystem-based fisheries management to guide this single species fisheries management that is occurring currently in the US Caribbean. So our final aim for this project is to develop a FEP, a Fisheries Ecosystem Plan, for the U.S. Caribbean in order to guide the implementation of a more ecosystem-based fisheries management for the U.S. Caribbean. Next. So in our project, as I mentioned, we really focused on the first step of the FEP loop in Lenfest, as like, where are we here now? And we had 3 main objectives. The first objective was to develop both a conceptual and quantitative model for the Caribbean ecosystems. And this is really to integrate a fisheries context. The second was to select and estimate indicators of the performance of this model. And the third was to integrate results from both of these models to identify threats in the US Caribbean. Next. So the research strategy, as I mentioned, was both qualitative and quantitative, and Tarsila will be describing the qualitative approach that we took for this program, this project, and JJ will be describing the quantitative approach for this project. So I will hand it off to Tarsila.
Thank you, Stacey. As Stacey mentioned, I'll be briefly summarizing the qualitative approach. I'm happy to, I'm not going to get into a lot of details on the methodology, but I want to give an overview of how we developed the conceptual models. And so if there are any questions, more specific questions, I'm happy to answer at the end or talk offline. JJ, can you go back one, please? Thank you. Happy to talk offline. And also, there's a lot of information on the more recent published paper. So, what we use to apps or conceptual models that were developed with stakeholders. So all of the conceptual models that we use were stakeholder driven. So we identified a number of different stakeholders and we worked with them to develop the conceptual models of the entire fishery ecosystem for the Caribbean. Next, please, JJ. And what we were hoping to achieve was a visualization of the ecosystem through the lens of the stakeholders, and also a way to identify priorities and risk factors to guide decision making, again, from the standpoint of the different stakeholders that we included in this project, which I will talk more about. Another goal of the conceptual models was to identify data gaps. So where stakeholders and elements and relationships that stakeholders identified as being very important for the ecosystem, but that we don't have a lot of data to explore these relationships and to understand these relationships. And also another objective here was to create conceptual models that could be tested with quantitative information that is currently available. And JJ will talk more about that approach in his slides. Next, JJ. All right, so here's just an overview of the different stakeholder groups and the different workshops and the different models that were created. So one thing that was, I believe, unique to the way that we approached this, and it was one thing that we were hoping to do with this was create conceptual models that were specific to stakeholder groups so that we could create one big melded model, but also have the ability to compare different models of different stakeholder groups and find convergences and divergences of opinions in a more objective way. So we did not construct these conceptual models with different stakeholders belonging to different stakeholder groups in the same room. We did construct them specifically with separately with each stakeholder group. So we had a total of 7 stakeholder groups: commercial fishers, managers, academics, businesses, NGOs, the district advisory panels that serve the Caribbean Fishery Management Council. These are composed by representatives of the local communities. And we also constructed a conceptual model with this scientific and statistical committee also for the Caribbean Fishery Management Council. So we had at least 3 different models for each island group. With the exception of the SSE model, that model was created for the entire US Caribbean. That was the only one that had that characteristic. But we did construct at least 3 conceptual models per stakeholder group. Some stakeholder groups had more than 3. And particularly with the commercial fishers, we wanted to increase representativeness. And so we um, did 12 conceptual models in total so that we could visit multiple communities. And most of these were in Puerto Rico just because of the
Tarsila, you froze up. Did she freeze up for anyone else?
Yeah, she froze up.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
might.
Yeah,
you're back.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have great internet at the lab, and so I apologize. If that happens again,
No
let me know.
worries.
What was the last thing that you heard me say, Emily?
Um, what is the last thing we heard her say? I'm like, stakeholder?
I think I said that word 100 times
I
already,
know.
so I don't know when. Anyway, um,
The
okay.
third
Thank you,
model.
thank you,
People are
thank you.
helping in
Okay.
the chat.
Awesome. Okay, so I was talking about, yeah, so the commercial fishers is the group that we have the highest numbers of models. We did more of them in Puerto Rico just because of the size of the island and the diversity of different communities that we visited. And we wanted to make sure that we were visiting these communities and constructing these conceptual models with the fishermen in their different vías pesqueras and the communities where they live and fish. And then I was just saying that you will notice that many of these were done in a virtual space, and this has everything to do with COVID. We felt comfortable doing a virtual workshops for managers, academics, businesses, NGOs. But we waited until we were able to do these in person, to do the commercial fishers, because as I said, we wanted to be able to visit the communities and interact with stakeholders in their communities. So we have a total of 29 conceptual models that involves 236 participants in total. Next, JJ. So for both in person and also the virtual state workshops, we constructed the models in Mental Modeler. The ones that we did in person, we just input them into the software so that we could create matrices like the one you can see here, where we could put the different elements, their relationship, and whether if those relationships were positive or negative. Next, JJ. And we ended up with something that looks like this. Is a big matrix where each relationship between elements that were identified, and these elements were meant to be elements that the stakeholders felt were important for the fishery ecosystem in the Caribbean. And then we asked them to identify relationships between these different elements. And so the models were created iteratively like that. We spent a lot of time making sure that because we're dealing with different stakeholder groups, sometimes they use different words but meant similar things. So we spent a really long time, and I want to say kudos to Chiara Acevedo for all her help with this. And this took a long time for us to work through the synonyms and make sure that we were comfortable with something that represented the stakeholders' perceptions, but that also did not include synonyms in the conceptual models that in reality should be combined because they meant the same thing. Next, JJ. So this is the whole conceptual model. This is the consensus model that includes all stakeholders, all 29 models. And the purpose of this visualization here is just to show the sheer amount of information that we got through these conceptual models. It's not entirely informative in terms of the relationships because it just turns into a blob. There's a lot of lines and a lot of different elements here, but you can see the amount and diversity of information, but also the elements that are have larger fonts here represent elements that were considered to be very important by multiple stakeholder groups that had multiple relationships with other elements. So you can see coral reefs, commercial fishers, marine habitat, water quality, fishery resources. All of these are popping up here as important elements for stakeholders. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these specific relationships. Next, JJ. So we analyze this information in a number of different ways. I mean, the really almost endless possibilities, but we were trying to look for where stakeholders may agree, what are some of the relationships that we could essentially flag as potential priorities, but also emphasis on understanding some of the idiosyncratic information that the stakeholders are bringing to the table. So here in this particular submodel of that big model that you just saw, we looked at which relationships were represented in at least four stakeholder groups' conceptual models, and that was the highest consensus number that we found in terms of relationships. And so we created this submodel where you can see very clearly that the majority of stakeholders are concerned about different elements that are impacting coral reefs, and some of these have to do with development, runoff, pollution, also climate change, marine diseases, water quality concerns, and you can see clearly that there is a indirect relationship here between fishery resources and coral reefs through the health of marine habitat. So those relationships were considered very important for the stakeholders. Next, JJ. Another way that we analyze this information to look at some of the priorities from the stakeholder perspective was using a two-mode network. Right here, what you're seeing is all of the elements that were considered drivers in the ecosystem. So any elements that were impacting either positively or negatively other elements in the ecosystem. Um, and it's a little hard to see, but there are these small gray squares that represent each one of the stakeholder groups. So all seven are represented. Yeah, thank you, JJ. That one's fisheries, the DAPS. You can see that they are all represented. And then the the circles represent the elements, and the colors represent how many stakeholder groups mention those elements as being important drivers of the ecosystem. So all the elements that are in red were elements that were identified by all seven stakeholder groups as being important for the ecosystem. Just one quick thing, JJ, in the previous slide. So while we can see well what are the elements that stakeholder agree, and we can potentially prioritize those as important for a number of different stakeholder groups, it is equally important to notice that there are many elements that are unique to the stakeholder group. So if you go out the sort of the outer area of this graphic here, you can see all the different elements in pink that were specific in terms of being represented in the conceptual models specific to each stakeholder group. So that shows that there's a lot of information that comes from each stakeholder group. So emphasizing the importance of having multiple stakeholder groups bring their perception to the table. Next, JJ. So in terms of agreement and convergence, um, we identified drivers and receivers that were identified by all 7 stakeholder groups, and we sort of listed them here as top priorities for all these stakeholders. As you can see, recreational fishing, coral reefs, runoff, tourism, education outreach, marine diseases, disturbances, coastal development, aspects of local culture and religious traditions, water quality, mangroves, and seagrass were these top elements. Um, Next, JJ. And after identifying these top elements, we also looked at major threats or major elements that had a negative relationship, and negative here meaning detrimental relationship to these significant components that were identified. And so we also, in this case, use the stakeholder conceptual models and the perceptions to identify threats or risks. And as you can see, some of the important ones have to do with pollution and increased nutrients, runoff, climate change, and climate change impacts. Um, but such as water temperature, but also increased frequency and severity of hurricanes, etc. And when you look at the components affected, again, coral reef shows up multiple times. So again, emphasizing that relationship and recognizing the impacts of different anthropogenic elements on coral reefs was a significant concern for stakeholders. Next, JJ. So here's just my last slide, summarizing a little bit how we're using this information. So these analyses were helped us to understand the ecosystem from the standpoint of the different stakeholders in the U.S. Caribbean. Right now, we are using this conceptualization of the ecosystem from the perspective of key stakeholders in the Fishery Ecosystem Plan. So that's one interesting application of the conceptual models. We're also, as I mentioned, able to identify priorities and also some risk elements. And this is currently being used to guide strategic objectives in that document. And also, it's being used in the development of a risk assessment framework that is currently being developed for the Caribbean. And I wanted to emphasize that this information that we collected here, the conceptual models, are particularly significant because the Caribbean is considered a data poor territory and data poor region. So a lot of this information can be extremely helpful to fill gaps of knowledge and have a better understanding of where these gaps are. So using this local ecological knowledge to complement and to understand and inform decisions becomes very, very important here. And JJ will talk more about that in his slides as well. And just the other thing that I wanted to emphasize with this is that this really created or initiated a process for we created a baseline that can be used to compare in different iterations of similar approaches. But also we initiated a process that contributed to increased buy-in and understanding of ABFM in the region. And it really begins important momentum of interacting with stakeholders, collecting this type of information, and then being able to refine our ability to incorporate stakeholder information into the development of EBFM and decision making for the Caribbean. So with that, I will pass it over to JJ and talk about the quantitative approach.
Thank you, Tarsila. Sorry, I was going back and forward with the slides, but it was doing it automatically.
I figured.
Yes. So now we're gonna talk a little bit about the quantitative side of things, and I mean there is a lot of can be said about it. So we try to concentrate on few messages related to management based on our results. Just as a reminder, we use publicly available data or data that was already produced that we classify in these different in these 5 components. Each component had different numbers of data sets. That's fishery independent, fishery dependent, environmental and anthropogenic variables, socioeconomic and habitat. All these components, all the data sets within each one of those components were analyzed using a multivariate approach, a multi-specific approach. And I just want to mention an example of what I'm saying is this is an example of the landings database where you have, like the different species on the top and the different observations, the different villa pesqueras, different years, different regions, different islands, etc., right? Traditionally, this data is analyzed one species at a time or one variable at a time, doing independent analysis on those species, right? And you do that once for the different species. But what differed our approach is that our analysis was for the entire data matrix using multivariate analysis. In this, as I said before, 10, 15 minutes of my presentation, I don't want to go into the details on the analytical details. Really happy to answer questions about it or talk about it after the presentation. So we're going to concentrate on the messages of what we found and minimize the showing you analytical and statistics. The first message that I want to share with you is that we found out that the 3 management units areas are very, very different. What you have here in this graph is just basically all the species listed on the left here, and then on the dark squares is like a relative abundance of that species. And then you can see that in the 3 management areas, you have different spots of dark. And this is not new. I mean, like and what you have here is actually the numbers behind those differences. These are dissimilarities. Like 100 is nothing in common, 0, they're identical. And what we found for landings that I showed you before, we found for all 5 components. It's not only the landings that are very different, but all other aspects are also very, very different. Please note that the only 2 components that were not different were fishery independent here and habitat for the comparison between St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. And again, this is not new, but what the message here is that now we have, for the first time, the quantitative information support for a decision that was made about a decade ago when we moved from a fisheries management plan for the whole region to island-based fisheries management plan. And the beauty about that is that it highlights the utility of the stakeholder information and knowledge. That decision was made only on the basis of stakeholder information. So what we are recommending here is that we develop the necessary tools to start gathering formally that information and getting into the decision-making process. The second thing that we observed was the high correlation structure among the species that were landed. Those little lines in red that you see there is that the only thing they mean is when you get one species, you get the other one. For example, in Puerto Rico, when you get lobster, you also get red hind and queen trigger, right? So this is just to put an example, the type of things are reported or landed together. So out of that information, what we were able to do was to identify indicator species and also facilitate the process of selecting species for the single species analysis or the single species assessment. The third message, or the third thing interesting, is that those dissimilarities that we observed between islands, we also observed within island. And what you have here in this table is a comparison of all the regions, north versus east, north versus south, north versus west, and so on, for the example of Puerto Rico. But this is the pattern that you see here is also true for the other two, for San Croix and San Thomas, sorry. And you can see that is true also for all the components. You have significant dissimilarities among regions. So basically what we took from this exercise is that those differences within island point to the suggestion that the management perhaps should be especially explicit, which is not done at the moment. At the moment is done for the entire island. Next, correlations between the different components, because we were trying to see what is driving those landings. Okay, so here what you have in these graphs are, you see the 5 components that I showed you before, and what you have here in the numbers are the correlation values between those 2 components. Remember, this is not one species at a time. This is the whole assemblage with the whole group of environmental variables, for example. Please note that this is the example of Puerto Rico, that there is a strong and significant correlation between environmental variables and landings. However, out of the 24 environmental variables and anthropogenic drivers that we included in the analysis, only those 4 that you see now in the screen were important in driving this correlation. And then if we zoom out on that, out of those 4 in Puerto Rico, those 3, productivity and temperature, were consistent for San Croix, San Thomas, and San John. So the conclusion here is that those 3 environmental variables to be used as environmental indicators in the FEP. No? So that's directly feeding the writing of the FEP. And this is cool because this in the specific case of productivity is in line of what Jason Link, another grantee, LENFES grantee in this big umbrella of EBFM, has found out, which is productivity can be used as an index of overall productivity for an ecosystem, rather than looking at the productivity of species one at a time. The other thing we found out is that, as I mentioned before, strong and high and significant correlation between the habitat and landings. In this case of Puerto Rico was 6-1, but it was also consistent with St. Croix and St. John, especially corals, macroalgae, and coralline algae, which is in line with what the stakeholders have been saying all the way along, which is the habitat. In this case, the corals are important in driving what we are getting out there. So basically, those three elements in yellow are being suggested to be indicators of the habitats for the U.S. Caribbean. Then finally, we have the correlation between the fisheries independent data, this one, and landings, and also significant and high correlation. And you say, oh, obviously, these are the animals that we are harvesting. But please note that the list of species that are responsible of that correlation are not the species that are economically important. What you have in the brackets here is the hierarchy of that species in terms of landings, right? How important it is. And please note that out of all that list, the only one in the top 10 is the yellowtail snapper. Everything else are not commercially important species. And what is what is the message here is that ecological interactions that we don't fully understand are driving the landings. The species that are not, like we're not harvesting are somehow driving or related to the patterns of landings. And finally, the striking characteristics of this analysis here is that there is no socioeconomic, right? You were able to see all other components, but a socioeconomic. And the reason for that is that we are not collecting that information, at least at the scales necessary to conduct analysis at the ecosystemic level. So the recommendation here is that please let's start actually gathering this data. I mean, every time we get together, we talk about the importance of the socioeconomic, but at the end of the day, we never collect the data, or if we collect it, it's not at the frequency needed to do this type of analysis. So what you have here is a list of conclusions for the quantitative approach, which is the first one is we definitely recommend that stakeholder information is formally included in the analysis and decision-making process for the U.S. Caribbean, the fisheries of the U.S. Caribbean. We have demonstrated that the fishery system can be described using a multi-species, multi-driver approaches. We use, and I didn't show these details to go straight to the message, but this approach is non-metric and non-parametric. And the beauty about that is that you don't need suppositions or underlying models. The data is just talking as the data is. We were able to identify indicators, not only for the environment, but also for the habitat and species, indicator species. We showed that reference points can be identified in a multidimensional, multi-species space, which leads to which is the basis to develop ecosystem level reference points, which is in line with what other groups working with EBFM in the US are following. And then our recommendation is that we should start implementing ecosystem level reference points instead of single species reference point like ABC or ACL, and use those ecosystemic reference. There are few out there that have already been developed, but we need to adapt to the US Caribbean. In this sense, I want to mention that there are already conversations among the different groups to meet and start exploring what will be those reference points for the US Caribbean. Based on our results and the results of other groups, look at the productivity is a good shows promise, but that's part of future work. And finally, and I did not show this today because it deserves a lot of attention and time to explain it. But our analysis that I did not show to you today, suggest that if we use all ACLs concomitantly, like if we fish all the species using the ACL that today we have defined, those ACL that were defined one species at a time, if we use it as a whole in a ecosystem point of view, there is no more fisheries. I'm gonna borrow a slide, a graphic that was developed by Jason Link in a paper where he defined something called ecosystem overfishing, right? Which is here, down here. Like on top, what you have is stock overfishing. It's like, out of all my entire assemblage, I concentrate in these two, in these species, right? So down the time, what you see is that only that species goes down, everything else is remain the same. But what we're talking here is when we see the issue as a whole, as an assemblage, actually what is happening, and our analysis show that, is that the entire ecosystem is could be overfished if we do not change our reference points. And with that, I just want to end this presentation on coming back to the beginning, right? Like, where are we? So, yes, we developed the conceptual models that's published in Seara et al. 2024. I believe Kayla put that reference on the chat. We have developed indicators, and that list have been provided to the EBFM tab. Also, an inventory of threats have been given not only to the EBFM tab, but also for the risk assessment people. And in addition to what the Lenfest Loop proposed, we developed the quantitative models, which is a paper that hopefully will be submitted within the next 2 months. With that, I just wanna open the space to answer questions, if any, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we can stop sharing screen so people can just see us. And maybe the only reason I was hesitating is if you needed to go back to a slide, but we'll play that one by ear. We do have questions coming into the chat, so I'll just get started there. So the first one, and this was in the chat too, which is asking why you had multiple groups in Puerto Rico, why mostly in Puerto Rico?
Okay, so I think that was in response to my question as to what was the last thing I talked about, but I can talk a little bit more about that. I mean, we had more in Puerto Rico, again, because of the size of the island, the diversity of fishing activity, and we wanted to make sure we had representation from multiple communities around the island. So that was the reason why we had more in Puerto Rico, but I think, yeah, that was...
Cool. Yeah, thank you. I also I see an attendee has their hand raised. FYI, if you can just put your question in the Q&A, we don't really have the ability to unmute people to ask their own questions. So please do put your question in the Q&A. Okay, we have a question. I'm curious about the major threats that Tarsila was discussing in the conceptual models. Did overfishing not percolate to the top of the major concerns for any of the groups? I did not see that on the list.
It's a great question. Couple of things. So the 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 element overfishing was present in some of the models, not many of them. I actually did check real quick. We had two conceptual models that did have relationships involving an element of overfishing. Those were only mentioned in the context of St. Croix, and they did mention the detrimental impacts of that on the coral reefs, on the local economy, on reef fish. Um, but it is the other thing that is important to keep in mind here is that even though perhaps the word overfishing was not mentioned as an element, pretty much I would say, many, if not all, of the conceptual models did establish relationships between various fishing activities and their impacts on the fishing resources, right? So, just having arrows that connect commercial fishing, recreational fishing, sometimes bycatch, and establishing a negative relationship between the fishing activities and the fishery resources, you are including in that perception of the ecosystem that if you increase fishing activities, you're going to have a decreasing impact on the fishery resources. So that relationship is very well established in the conceptual model. So even if you don't see the word overfishing and that didn't was not picked up as a particular threat there, but that relationship exists. However, with that said, it was not one of the top relationships that we identified when we looked at the sort of the idea of convergence and consensus among all of the different stakeholders.
Cool, thank you. We have another question. Current ACL are established by species, correct? So is the suggestion and recommendation to establish ACLs based on the whole of the fishery? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question because it allow me to clarify. No, the proposal the proposal is to move away from things from like ACLs and then have ecosystem reference point. Now we use ACL as a reference point, one species at a time, and the idea is to, based on an ecosystem-based fisheries management approach, is to drop those, or at least to have an hybrid. Like for example, species like spiny lobster or the groupers or the snappers. Would be a good idea to keep those species reference point. But for everything else that is managed and we don't have enough data, the recommendation we're proposing to move away from ACL and use ecosystem level reference points. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And we have questions rolling in, so I'm just going to keep going. Does the diagram shown by Dr. Cruz-Motta suggest that overfishing of one or several stocks constitutes ecosystem overfishing, or that it could be an unappreciated result of overfishing over time?
The second.
Short answer.
Yeah, because the colleague that raised the question actually has a clear what the two alternative
Yeah.
models are, and is the second. Thank you for that question because put it out there very clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Curious to know who were the four, I think, stakeholder groups that identified coral reefs as a priority.
So I think maybe what we need here is a clarification, and I apologize if I was going too fast and that wasn't clear. So it was not just 4 stakeholder groups that identified. Coral reef was actually identified as a priority by all 7 of them. It was one of the top elements for all stakeholder groups. You're probably referring to the slide that I talked about, the sort of the submodel, where those were the relationships, so not just elements, but relationships that showed up um, in at least 4 stakeholder groups. So different groups, but we looked at the list of relationships, and then we essentially just sorted, okay, which relationship showed up in the highest number of conceptual models, and the highest number was 4 separate conceptual models. So we took those and created that submodel of relationships that showed the same on different conceptual models, and it was at least 4. So that's this. I hope that clarifies. But as a priority, all of them agreed coral reef was a priority.
Yeah, no, that's great. I don't think it's a question of you not being clear. I think it's just a lot of
It's a
information.
lot, yeah.
So thank you folks for asking to follow up on things. That's great. Okay, we have a question here. Um, and I'm curious to see your answer to this. I'm amazed that after all these years, the socioeconomic and cultural variables are brushed under the rug. Despite Tarsila number of studies on the topic and the amount of papers on the topic, which include LEK, C. Garcia Quijano, and others, one question among the academics, did you have social scientists? All the best. And yes, we did.
Yes.
Um,
Well, yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. I mean, I guess there's a couple of important things here. The first, I mean, what we are showing with the conceptual models is essentially what we got from the stakeholders, right? So we are not interjecting any of our own necessarily, opinions, or we're not prioritizing things based on anything rather than just taking the information that we got from the stakeholders. So the representation of the conceptual models is whatever they told us were elements that were important for them. That's what we had to work with. So that represents their perceptions to the best of our methodological abilities in collecting the data, right? There was certainly a number of very important social and economic variables that were mentioned. The one thing is, when we're looking at a very large number of stakeholders, a lot of different information, and we put it all together, some of these were more idiosyncratic to different stakeholder groups. So we were very careful to, in the paper that we published, to include conceptual models that were stakeholder specific conceptual models. And then you see for the different stakeholder groups that there are certain elements that you can see clearly are very important that sort of get watered down when we look at the entirety of the of the stakeholder perceptions. So they are there when but once we analyze things in terms of numbers of which elements are at the top, which relationships are at the top, those were the elements and relationships that I presented that were at the top based on our analysis of that. Um, I wish we had more social scientists amongst the academics. We don't have a great deal of them necessarily, and we invited people, and then the participation is a little bit beyond our our control. But so yeah, I think, I don't know if JJ, if you and Stacey, if you have any other thoughts here, but that's just what I can think of.
Yeah, no, I thank you for the question, and I can just say it's Lenfest Ocean Program too. I appreciate you raising the topic because more and more we have had people coming to us across all the projects we fund, and we have dozens and dozens of funded projects ongoing. The need to bring together social and natural science has only grown and grown. So just keep bringing it up. It is really important. And so I'll go on to the next question because we only got about a minute left. And maybe this is the one we end on, because yeah, we're getting right up at 1 o'clock here. What additional information and data would need to be gathered to enable use of productivity as an ELRP based on the Link and Watson paper?
Thank you. The Link paper is basically is using 3 indices. Out of those 3, 2 uses something related, a metric related to productivity. One is productivity, and the other chlorophyll A. So basically, if we use those indices as suggested by Link, with information on concentration of chlorophyll A and landings, because the index are related to, we could calculate the indices. However, in our personal this project view, we believe those ecosystemic reference points should be a little bit more complex. I mean, should take into consideration the multidimensionality of the problem. And then in that scenario, the data that we end up collecting will depend on the shape of that ecosystemic reference point. The important thing here is with our study, we show that it can be described in a multi-specific, in a multidimensional space. You can identify that dot. The thing is, are we gonna take also economic considerations to move that reference point in that space? Are we gonna take a risk from an ecological point of view? So there is I mean, these different groups that have been working with EBFM really need to get together to start talking about the different metrics that can be used to come up with an ecosystemic reference point. Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, and thank you everybody who joined us today. Thank you for all the great questions. You know, when you get a lot of questions, it's a great presentation because it gets people thinking. And so thank you for joining us. We'll send the recording around. We'll download the questions we didn't get to. And JJ, Tarsila, and Stacey, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.